Hey everyone, my name is Juliet, and together with Susan, we will be leading today's webinar. And we're focusing more on making in a different sense, in that we're looking at more of informal communities in Africa, and in the States, we're looking at students. I'm looking at more of minorities. So I'll let Susan first do an intro and a background on what she's involved in before we kick off.
I work with a small program in Boston that for 12 years has been focusing on working with youth of color and mostly low-income youth and getting them into science, technology, engineering, and math through maker activities. Even before there was making and maker education, we were doing it because that's what the youth told us worked with them.
Okay, sounds fantastic. And I'm from Kenya, and I'm involved in Maker Ed and a more informal version of that in teaching appropriate technology to more of late teens, young adults. And so I run a program called Fundi Workshops. Fundi is like the equivalent of what you'd call a maker in East Africa. So the word maker hasn't really picked up, but every time you say Fundi, someone kind of gets a picture of what you're saying. And so these are based in Kenya and Uganda, and I'm currently in Burundi, so I'm doing some work there. Yeah, and so this morning, sorry, I'm in Burundi, so it's evening right now. We have a couple of really great guests joining us, and we'll start off with Nettrice. So she's the director of the Boston Arts Academy STEAM Lab, and she's done a lot of great work on responsive making and maker education, and just finding like that great fusion that adds on hip hop and Afrofuturism. So I'll share her blog, and it's on the musings of a renegade futurism: art, technology, and culture at the margin. So that's definitely very interesting. And we also have Debbie. And Debbie is an associate professor of material science at Orleans College. And Debbie is very passionate about working with undergraduate students to imagine and improve engineering education. So we'll be sharing more of her work, and what particularly we'll be focusing on is her write-up on why I'm not a maker. And lastly, we have Amon, and he's an assistant professor of computing innovation and collaborative fellow at Orleans College. So I think many of us know Amon for his work on developing Scratch and pickleboards and Modkit, which we all love and enjoy using our programs. And he's established a couple of local and international hubs for learning and digital fabrication. So it'd be great to hear from him what his experience has been. So just to guide this webinar, we have like a couple of areas of interest we're looking to talk more about. And I mean, our first question is, how do we create a new history and definition of making and maker education that represents a new and informal humanity perspective? And the reason we came up with this with Susan is that, so Susan's working more with students of color, and I'm working more with low-income communities in Africa. And so that's not generally what you get when, say, you Google makers. And so we're looking at makers at the margins, and just the potential, the work that's being done there, and just seeing that in a whole different scope, and how the approach is in some ways very different. The impact is definitely worth looking into. So yeah, that's where we'll kick off.
So I guess Deb and I, as you can see, we're two heads in one box because we're both at Olin College together right now. So I believe we can jump into the conversation, and we welcome Nettrice if you want to chime in while we're going back and forth. We're not necessarily taking the podium for a certain amount of minutes. So I'd just like to introduce the way that I think about some of the comments that we've said about makers at the margin. And if you look at international context in different parts of the United States and how the term maker is received, how do we create a new manifesto or marching orders around bringing up the generation of people who are going to make? So there's a lot of controversy around the term maker, and Deb might share her thoughts on that. But at the core, if we look at a new humanity, I like to start at people being born as makers, or people that are curious. And I look to the work of The Scientist in the Crib, which was a book about 15 years ago that says people are already born curious and they're trying to take things apart around them, and they're little scientists when they come out of the womb. And so, I think it's more of a humanity has this built in, and how do we retain it and amplify it and celebrate it across all cultures is the mission, as opposed to starting from zero and teaching it at a certain point. So I'm more of a preservationist in terms of the maker community, in trying to get people early so that you can retain and amplify and celebrate wherever you are, no matter what you call it. As you mentioned, it could be fundi, it could be maker, it can be innovator.
Right. Yeah, I teach here at Olin College, and I teach our design courses. Mostly I teach undergraduate students. My research is actually looking at the engineering student experience. So it's very educationally focused. And I actually don't think that the term maker is actually super controversial in the United States. And the reason why is because it's been almost entirely appropriated by the sort of capital M maker movement culture, which is generally quite affluent. It's generally white. It's not entirely, but generally male. And so one of the things I'm interested in is ties in with both what you said about this is the thing that everyone does, and the general sort of idea and manifesto behind this is that only certain types of making sort of get recognized as making and get sort of fostered and celebrated and supported. And so even though what I actually wrote about, I also think that caregivers and educators and so forth should also be celebrated and valued, that isn't at odds with broadening the idea of what making is and who does it. And one of the things I actually wanted to throw out there is Ursula Franklin, who's actually a metallurgist training, who does work around technology and culture. In her book, is actually a set of lectures called The Real World of Technology. She talked about the role of technology in shaping sort of social norms around it. And in particular, she talked about prescriptive versus holistic technology. So the example she used for prescriptive technology was she did research on 2,000-year-old Chinese bronzes. And they needed to be made, they're all cast in they're sort of hundreds of pounds for these vessels. They were cast in one piece. And so what it meant was that everybody who was involved in that process basically needed to have their piece ready at exactly the right moment so that this bronze vessel could be cast together. And she described this as a prescriptive technology. And she compared this to holistic technology. So you think about being a potter and you're making a vessel where you have control over the entire process from start to finish. You have a very deep understanding of what you're doing. And one of the points that she made from this is that different types of technology foster different types of sort of social behavior or social norms. And in particular, holistic technologies, where people are working on them as individuals and they have control and they have autonomy, foster very different types of social norms than prescriptive technologies where people work together on projects. And so one of the ways that I think about sort of making of the maker movement is giving people this sort of autonomy and this sort of control over what they do. And that's one of the things that I find most interesting about the maker movement. So less about, so as, on top of the whole sort of getting people into STEM piece, thinking about it as, okay, here is this thing that I'm responsible for from beginning to end, that I have this understanding of, and then the way you intersect with people in that context versus technologies where you don't have that kind of control over the whole thing. I think about this a lot with our engineering students, because there's a big difference. And actually one of the reasons why I think the maker movement is popular among people like coders is that because it is very physical, it is very hands-on based, but you're not doing something as part of a cog in a machine, right? You're not doing this as like something you do that you're responsible for a tiny piece of things and you're working with other people and you're under you can see this as a super positive thing, which is that you get to work with other people to make something, but you can also see it as you're under someone else's control, which is often not seen as a positive thing. And contrasting that with I decided to make this thing, I chose how I was going to make it, I built it, I shared it, is sort of in a different place. And so that's one of the things that I think is really interesting, sort of a really interesting space about maker culture. And I'm interested in basically broadening those sort of positive effects to as large a group as possible. And I talked about men and women and recognizing a lot of what women do as making, what gets recognized as making. And this ties in with your idea basically the child in the crib, and that children basically start by making things. So basically broadening our definition of what making is, broadening our ideas of who gets to do it, and making it more accessible to lots of people. And then potentially using that as a stepping stone to shape experiences that lead to people going into STEM and other fields.
Okay. Well, right now we're on vacation here, Boston Public Schools, and it's snowing outside again. So
Okay.
we've had a lot of snow. Anyway, good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Don't know where people are coming from. So I am running, actually Boston Arts Academy is an urban arts high school. And it's also full inclusion, which means when middle school students in sort of audition, they come in, they're not, if their grades are not looked at necessarily, it's their talent and skills. So when they come in with, music, visual arts, dance, music splits into vocal and instrumental and so on. And that's interesting because they have a STEAM component, which adds the art to the STEM piece of things, but also because you're talking about young people who are preparing themselves for a world that requires more and more technology. And so how do you engage? And also in terms of demographics, it's 40% African-American, 40% Latino. So that's 80% African-American Latino groups who are underrepresented in STEM by and large. So that's an important thing to note as well. So how do you bring to kids who don't think of themselves as coders at all, and some of them do think of themselves as coders, or at least are interested, how do you bring young people who aren't represented in tech fields, Google's 2%, you name it, how do you engage them in something that they feel they don't have they're not a part of? So my interest has been in identifying and broadening the net for technology. Redefining technology and redefining what we think of in terms of makers in order to capture what has been happening in different, like hip hop or someone said Afrofuturism, which is more of an aesthetic. How do you capture the making that's going on in those groups that fit or fall into a lot of what you see in what we call maker spaces now? The one person I always go to, at least in the beginnings of my research, was Grandmaster Flash, because Grandmaster Flash was actually invented a device, something that every DJ around the world uses today, which is a crossfader. And how he invented it is he went and found junk in the Bronx, New York, and he took the junk and Radio Shack parts or whatever, and he invented as a teenager, didn't have a lot of money. He created something that now everyone uses. Right. And so that's an important thing, because one, you have a young person who fits that underrepresented group who is using scientific methods to develop a technology or something that we would consider that is very innovative. In addition to that, he was actually, instead of just looking at junk equipment, he was also mastering innovations such as scratching, which we talk about scratch programming being influenced by DJ scratching. Here's the guy who, in addition to inventing the crossfader, innovated a method that is also used, which is scratching. Right. So here, you see a lot of this kind of work within these kind of artistic forms, the creative forms. Right. So my goal was to look at that as a domain of study and a domain of research. So not just Grandmaster Flash, but also any artist or practitioner who's using those kinds of on the do-it-yourself or make it as you go, or whatever you had in terms of necessity together to create a technology, or to create art and technology together. Music was oftentimes a part of it as it relates to African American and Latino audiences, but also looking at Native American or indigenous groups who are also inventing or innovating or being creative with what they had on, whether it's junk or whether it's cultural or craft. Those kinds of things are important, because you then can tie that into what young people are coming from their communities, and then find a way to sort of link what we think of in terms of maker and maker education to what they are familiar with.
Right. So they're socially or artistically contextualized from the outset, basically.
Yeah. So culturally responsive or culturally relevant, art-based technology, so to speak.
So it's important to note that on the Grandmaster Flash scratching point is that the Scratch programming language was made from taking different types of media and mixing it together, just like you took musical media. So the name Scratch played homage to Grandmaster Flash and Company for bringing that innovation about. And I think it ties to taking existing interests of the young people that come into, say, a middle school with an interest in performing arts and what people call emerging technologies. So making the intersection between existing interests and emerging technologies, that can be a form of empowerment for people that have historically been marginalized or disempowered. And one of the things that I point to and why I focused on programming early was that there were no strong forces keeping people out of the domain, especially in a place where you can be stripped of most of your physical characteristics. For example, if you show up with a piece of code and you have an app already, a lot of times that can show up before you as a person arrive, and then you've got something in the world and you weren't separated or kept out of a particular area based on the way that you look. So if you can have an app in your hand or have a piece of code out in the world and contributed to one of these projects, then you show up later and you're already a member of the community. And so it's more, you've already been accepted without having your appearance, and that's been an enabler. So the emerging technology of computing and connecting across wires without having to be in person allowed for the creation of things from a wide variety of people. And the number of problems that can be solved with computing in particular, as you can see, the growth of computing taking on so many different fields, computational biology, computational art, is being a part of so many new areas. There needs to be all hands on deck. So that mirrors an older trend in computing when Ada Lovelace and company were thinking about early programs, and when at times where men were away at war and women played an important role in the computing landscape, that's been largely forgotten. However, when you need all hands on deck, there are huge doors and opportunities for people to come in and learn about a field and be pioneers in it.
Right.
And so I think that with so many branches of computing now, there's a lot of opportunities for anybody to come in, especially if you aren't turned away based on how you look initially. So that's why I like to leverage the emerging technologies in computing and hopefully tie them to existing arts to bring people into the door. And then once they're in the door, there's a place at the table for everyone, at least right now at this moment, because that's not the case in all fields that young people, especially people of color, go into.
Right. And I think, and that actually sort of leads to the question, which is that I look at things like, who participates in open source software projects, or, who goes into these things. And so part of the piece for me is, if we see gender disparities or disparities by demographics of who participates, is how do we design experiences that are actually welcoming to people from different backgrounds? Because that's what I fear. It's like, yes, like once you're in the door, you have this pathway, this world of pathways open to you, but it's pretty clear that there's issues in terms of getting in the door and in terms of issues of getting out. So I think, open source software is a good example, right? That, one thing is, it's like, yes, in principle, anyone in the world can participate. And in the reality, it's predominantly men, and it's very many white men. And so it's like, who has the background, who has the time, but also what are the cultural norms of the community that keep people out? And that's one of the things I worry about. It's one of the things I'm sort of super conscious of when I think about makerspaces. I had discussions with people who are kind of like, if we build it, they will come, for makerspaces. And I certainly have, the data that I have around engineering students and sort of environments and spaces is how there's really no such thing as a neutral space, right? There's things that are welcoming, that if you're not sort of consciously welcoming to people, it's very easy to have it only be welcoming to certain subgroups. And so that's, this is why I think this is really interesting. But thinking about how to generalize that.
Well, one of the things that the term I came up with in thinking about how, groups that are historically marginalized from science and technology or engineering was techno-vernacular creativity, or the production that kind of gets at what Amiri Baraka wrote about in 1971. which gets to the question about the humanity part, because he began to articulate, him and other scholars after him, the cultural nexus between art, Western technology, and its impact on African cultural practices. And Baraka kind of called for people of African descent to rethink their relationships with technology and to take action to make technology more representative of their culture. He argued that through Black technological utterances rooted within Black cultures, communities, and existences, through that technology would be more responsive to the realities of Black life in Western societies. So that was 1971 when he put this essay out. So that's a long time ago. So he was kind of putting forth what we are now talking about today. Right. And then other scholars and researchers and practitioners have read that or, referenced that. And I think it's important to make a note of that this is something that people have been talking about as it relates to these groups that we say are marginalized or not part of discourse around this type of work. And so I wanted to create a taxonomy to look at how we could actually talk about what kinds of things are happening when people are engaging with technology that is not part of the discourse. Right. So how can we assess it, for example, in learning? Or what is the learning? Oops. Something's going on there. Okay. So just taking a look at how we can figure out how people are doing what they're doing. I don't know, it's getting audio. Getting an audio thing going on.
Mario, can you mute your speaker?
1 sec, I'll get it.
Mario's coming in from Germany.
Okay. So reappropriation is one of the things that I looked at, and to define that is kind of looking at in terms of key concept, reappropriating is the process, but when you underrepresented ethnic groups reclaim artifacts from dominant culture. Mm-hmm. So artists who use commercial images in their work or so on and so forth. Improvisation, which is huge in across the African diaspora, which is kind of the spontaneous and inventive use of materials. So using on-the-spot techniques to make, different projects. And then conceptual remixing, so tinkering and making do with whatever's on hand. So artists who are combining different, seemingly disparate knowledge sets, artifacts, identities, and practices. All these combination of these creative modes kind of result in the invention of new practices, works, or performance modes. Right. So then I started looking at through that lens and finding that there are a lot of people who are actually doing that kind of thing long before I was aware of it. And one of them being Ben Hardy. I don't know if anyone knows about Ben Hardy, but Ben Hardy is the guy who made the motorcycles or the choppers in Easy Rider. And because he was African-American, they kept his race. No one ever talked about it till long after his death, that he was the guy who is known for in sort of creating the chopper, the bike to have, and that. And this, we look at lowrider culture with Chicano groups and realize that this is a way of using suspension systems and hydraulics with automobiles. So when we brought in the net, we start picking up on so many other different types of projects that we never really talk about when we talk about maker education or maker spaces that I think are really important to make a note of. And we're starting to look at, as people had said earlier, from birth, but also from necessity, that people are creating things from their environment using technologies in ways that never thought of, that I think are really interesting and really engaging for people who may not see themselves in doing something like being in a maker space.
Right. And actually, the thing you said about Ben Hardy and his race thing, and I just want to actually throw in the idea of, and I'm just saying this to put on the table because I'm sure you're all aware of it, is the idea of erasure of people who've done work. And I recently discovered that the person who invented the cartridge-based video game system was an African-American engineer. Yep. And I had never come across that. Because he was one of extremely few African-American engineers at the time. And if people are interested, I found a great interview with him before he passed away that I'll share. But so that erasure piece is important. So one, or at least to me, it's important, right? One is finding the people who are working in conventional means whose race is not, who's sort of kept out of the picture. And the other is what are the vernaculars? What are people doing outside of the mainstream discourse?
You hear about people like that sometimes at their death, and those, because I remember that
The obits.
announcement.
Yeah.
And who people have as role models, and we mentioned maker spaces, who is available for the young and aspiring person to identify with that is already in, say, an engineering or STEM field.
Right.
Those are important pieces because there are images associated with what is a scientist and what is an engineer. And as Nettrice brings up, people are engaging in the types of activities that are great fuel for becoming a practicing engineer or scientist, such as improvisation and things that are at the core, but they're not necessarily talked about in the light of this will prepare you for being a great engineer. And they're not, so the connections that can be made from hip hop to electrical engineering, for example, and having people that have crossed that bridge before and have the connections, there's a hard time motivating young people to take that path, or by seeing people that are out of their neighborhood have walked that path before, and it's especially difficult if people have been erased.
Right.
And I believe that some of the efforts in what we can do about this in makerspaces that Susan is intimately familiar with here in Boston at the South End Technology Center is finding the teens that younger people are looking up to, as opposed to having the practitioners that are out in different fields and may have left a particular neighborhood to go work at the IBMs,
right.
and the Mark Deans that are out there getting patents for personal computers and such. They may not be in the neighborhoods from which they came, but right. You can also focus on the teenagers and get them involved, because there's young people that are always looking up to them. So then you get the 12-year-olds and the 11-year-olds engaged as well. So the spaces that, again, capitalize on the young people are already mostly makers, and we just take that away over time right. to a education system that may not celebrate it. Then I think that we have a lot of a means of doing something about this if we focus on creating maker spaces that are open for more teens and the younger people behind them, and that will provide some of the missing mentors, because it wasn't always celebrated if your inventions didn't come along with your race a lot of times. But we have more visibility using technologies, and teens have YouTube channels, and there's a lot. Everybody can be a celebrity at this point, so you get to announce and broadcast your accomplishments and capabilities, and people get to see what you look like and where you came from along the way. And there's not a limited channel in terms of, we only get the Mark Zuckerbergs put in front of us in terms of popular media. Right. Now everybody's in front of everyone. That's right. A different dynamic that we can use.
On the issue of vernacular specifically, one of the question that came to me during my studies, probably during the exam process, oral presentation, question from a faculty member was, we talk about maker education, and some of these technologies are pulling together existing technologies. But what happens when you build a platform or a system from a non-Western, in terms of, and it has that, putting kind of that forward was something that was really challenging for me to think about. So we're building on something that we talk about in the West, but what happens if you build it on a system that is African? What happens there? So then I started saying, well, then I kind of have to broaden the way I see technology, because right now everything I see is sort of Western based. Right. Then I have to look at something that it may not be seen by the West as a technology, but acts as and is by definition a technology, or a way or system by which people create interaction in the real world, whether that's both analog or digital or both. And then, and I thought that was important to then engage people who are interested in technology from that point of view, because then that is not as a bridge, not so much as a carrot to getting into more traditional fields, but as a way to get them engaging in new ways with technology that may be more innovative. And that's an ongoing process. It's not something that was just within the box of working on a PhD, but it's now part of a conversation, an ongoing series of conversations with artists who are actually interested in that kind of thing in terms of connecting to STEM.
Can you give examples of those kinds of systems?
One of the things that we've been looking at is the Bakongo cosmogram, which is a chart, a map of the world. One of the things I realized is in many non-Western cultures, including in Asia, so the Rangoli in India, or the mandala in Buddhist cultures, is the system, or it's a map of the world. It's to map the way that culture sees the world. But in the case of the cosmogram, there are actually symbols and directions and charts and ways in which you kind of engage this device. Then I was looking so much at it, realizing that John Coltrane created a cosmogram or mandala in the 60s to construct the composition for one of his famous songs.
Okay.
So if you were to play this device, you would actually be able to play this particular song. So he tied that chart, that map, the idea of looking at the world, which now someone is tied to physics, and he's made it into an actual something you can interact with. And then, of course, then we have the music. So now we're jumping from disciplines. We're jumping from starting with a cultural map or system, moving into something that has been now consumed by jazz, in this case, jazz. And at Boston Arts Academy, kids actually learn. This is a very complex composition called Giant Steps. And Giant Steps has its own Wikipedia section for Cycle of Fifths, because it was so innovative at the time. So now it's an innovation, much like Grandmaster Flash. He also created a device to play it, which is based on a cultural map. So we jump from the culturally responsive piece, but we also move into it as a technology. In this case, moving towards a music technology that allows people to then engage other types of things that are more traditional in terms of STEM. And I think it's really important to realize that this has been going on for a long time. So this isn't a new conversation. John Coltrane's been gone for a long time. This was the 60s when he did this. But you can now tie it for young people, the math piece, the cultural chart piece, and then the performance or music piece that, and a lot of kids are really shocked to find out that Coltrane was into physics or that he was into technology, until they realized how deeply he was really into Einstein and really into theory of relativity and so on. And then it becomes a conversation about the cognitive dissonance that happens in conversations with these young people who have learned this complex composition but didn't know the other parts of it. And now we have a really deep conversation that may engage them in some way and may make them more interested in science or more interested in the technology piece before they actually did the music part.
Yeah.
How are we doing, moderators, in terms of allocating the time for? I know there was a manifesto.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah,
moving towards a manifesto.
Definitely moving towards the manifesto. And I really like the way you guys have chimed in, because like part of what we're looking at in the manifesto is like how do we, it's linked to our first question, how do we revision the history of making and expression of making, and what do that look like? And so the history side, I really like how Nettrice has brought in all these other aspects that are often overlooked. But in the expression part, I'd love to hear more of what we're doing great now. Leave this as an open conversation and what could be done better. And fellows are just definitely welcome to add on to this.
Well, I mean, sorry, go ahead, Susan.
Who is that? Oh,
that wasn't me, Nettrice. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was just going to invite a few of the folks. Maybe we could start with Paulo and Sylvia and then move to some of the fellows who are on to respond to what's been said by thinking about what you would put in a manifesto. Why is reimagining and re-envisioning important? What's the history that we need to recover? Who are our ancestors and what traditions? Who's a maker and who needs to be included? These are some of the questions that I put on this Google Doc. what is maker culture? Susanna had something to say about that. And what's important to make? Where do people make and engage in maker education, and how do we define it? So in terms of responding, we wanted to try to develop a manifesto that would encompass all of that, and that would be a statement that could guide our practices and the practices of others. So do Sylvia or Paulo or any of the other fellows want to chime in?
Don't forget to unmute first.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm not sure, manifesto is a tough word, because manifesto sort of means a short piece that says everything, you know, and that's a tough one. You guys have said so much. I mean, it just made me think. I've wrote 1,000 pages of notes. I swear, you know, I'm really excited by some of these ideas. Even just the first thing I wrote down about it being transgressive and disruptive. And I think how that meshes with gender and politics. Transgressive and disruptive is not nice. It's not what girls tend to go for. And we see that in comedy. All comedy is transgressive and disruptive. You know, new forms of art are transgressive and disruptive until they're sort of assimilated into the body of the whole. And then everyone goes, of course, Impressionism is lovely. You know, of course, I love Mozart. And in their times, they were transgressive and disruptive, and only done by men, and could only be done by people who were outside of the margins, and then be brought in by people who are in the inside. So I think making people on the inside more aware of what's going on is part of what I consider my mission. You know, I've been sitting here posting stuff to the chat window. Everything you guys say, I've got a link up there. So to me, it's almost like, now maybe that's just my personal mission view, is that a manifesto is narrowing, and it's almost like we need like this whole garden, you know, to support what we're saying, because some people are interested in the art message, and some people are interested in the politics message, and some people are interested in this idea that you don't have to simplify everything to make it palatable. You know, I posted a essay by Herb Cole on the politics of children's literature, what's wrong with the Rosa Parks story, because the story we tell in school is this incredibly stupid, simplified story that completely strips it of its power. And the story about maker now in schools, because hacker spaces would not be accepted in schools, right? So that changing the H to an M made it acceptable for schools. Right, and open the door to it being simplified and dumbified and stripped of its power. So how do we keep that power, right, and and still embrace the word, because the word opened the door, the M opened the door, right, and how do we then march through with the full power of what we're trying to say? Well, I mean, so there are more questions, no answers. Sorry.
Well, so the thing, it's like I see your Impressionism and Stravinsky, and I raise you the punk movement, right? So I think about this idea of, and so yes, like to a certain extent, that also got brought into sort of the mainstream culture, but that was particular what I think of as a time and a place, which was particularly about outsiders making so music, zines. It was explicitly related to politics. There was an extremely high percent, number of women who were involved with it, and again, watching that systematically, like watching when people look back at 20-year retrospectives of grunge, and watching like the Riot Girl movement be sort of systematically erased out of that. And yet so a very sort of similar idea. One of the things that I think we sort of touched on, but we haven't explicitly said, is this idea of, there are sort of vernacular technologies, there are sort of DIY technologies at one end, and there's a sort of mainstream sort of, STEM success, let's say, at the other end, right? So the question is, are we about generating a pathway from one to the other? Because that's certainly a lot of things we talked about were about bringing them in. Or are we okay with saying, like, look, if you do vernacular technology on your own in your community, and you never get a job at Microsoft, right? Like and I think we would say that's okay too. But that's something that we might want to sort of explicitly decide, what the pathway is, and what is it for, and what the endpoint is, and what the alternatives to the pathway that we want to think about or include are as well.
I think that's brilliant, because the parallel of courses in scholars and organic intellectuals. Because part of my work has been to try to, how come organic intellectuals in the community are not cited, or their ideas respected, or they're even given ownership of their ideas or their innovations? What makes going to a university or being part of the mainstream maker culture, how is that, making that knowledge more palatable or real than what other folks are doing in more informal and what we're calling vernacular.
Right.
Let's get back to the humanity piece. If we are intending to make a pathway where there is a traditional field that doesn't have a lot of representation, and then we have a conduit through maker spaces or these activities, like, I think from a humanity standpoint, we can be innovative together if all the ideas from all the different types of minds come together. So as one large ideal, making sure that everyone can be more innovative by having an intersection with people that are very different from them.
Right.
So I think that main goal, whether it's taking people from the main industry into the niche areas,
right,
or it's taking people from the niche areas to the main, I think the goal being humanity.
Yeah. So not as a trajectory, but thinking about it as sort of bringing people from different spaces together. Period.
I feel like go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add a couple of things. I agree with Sylvia about the difficulties of manifesto, but I think it might be a good exercise. If we're not happy with the manifesto itself, I think the discussion is, because it has to converge to some basic or some agreed upon ideas. I think it's a good exercise. Amon and I in 2010, and some other people that you might know, like Karen from Harvard, and Dor from Berkeley, and all of that. So there was a conference called Constructionism 2010, and we did a panel called like Constructionists Under Construction. I don't know if you remember Amon. But anyways, so we came up with like 4 principles for this kind of making constructionist learning and all of that. And I'm trying to find the actual slide to show, but I think that discussion was, even though it was really hard to get to some basic principles, it was very useful to converge on some things we believe in and we are important in this discussion. I think in my own group here at Stanford, we try to work with 4 principles, but 2 of them that are relevant to this is this idea of epistemological pluralism, which is people have different ways of knowing and learning. We need to be accepting of that. Another one is that schooling should be in the service of equity. So that's something we should always think about. And
what did you say? Schooling should be in the service of
equity.
Equity.
Yeah. So just thinking about those 2 things, for example, if you look at the maker movement and the fact that 97% of the maker fair attendees have college degrees,
right?
Immediately we already understand that there is a big equity problem there.
Yeah.
So I think having in mind some principles like equity, pluralism, and things like that are important. And I think it's becoming even more important to think about principles. So I had a conversation with James the other day, who is, I don't know if he's here or not, but so he was telling me a shocking but interesting story about a project that he had of like creating this derby cars, wooden cars that run on tracks and stuff like that.
Like Cub Scout Derby.
Nerdy Derby.
Nerdy Derby, yeah. And how it was like wildly successful at the Maker Faire every year and all of that. And then because Ford Motor, bought a big space at the Maker Faire, and they want to do their own derby thing, that his project was, they told him to go way back where no one can see it, because it would compete with the Ford Motor version of it. And so, I mean, I think this is, the kind of thing that worries me, because I think there is like an increasingly dangerous set of conflict of interest in the maker movement. And, I've been saying for a long time that I think educators have to be in charge of it, because, we can't let like a company or, an organization that is not connected to education be in charge of something that has so much influence in how, basically 90% of the progressive education these days is channeled to the maker movement, right? So, I don't want that to be in the hands of people that have like, other kinds of agendas. And so just to say that I think the manifesto, whatever comes out of it might be a good way to think about an agenda that's not like, impositive or prescriptive, but just an agenda of principles and ideas that educators should think about when they are thinking about making, right? I think one of the, if there was one thing that the whole like FabLearn conferences, one thing made all of them be like, a valuable endeavor, which was, Leah's keynote talk in 2013, which I think really woke people up to this issue of inequity in the maker movement. And I think it has had a big, it has been very influential. And, I think this is the kind of thing that, we need to keep doing, right?
Good. I mean, I'm such a big fan of basically articulating, like, so much culture goes unwritten and unremarked. And I'm sort of, one of the things that to me is really interesting about this manifesto is that there is no manifesto for the maker movement, or there is, but it doesn't reflect what the actual, the inequities that we see in the groups are. Actually articulating a manifesto that is explicitly recognizing and speaking to these things, I think is valuable, sort of in and of itself, regardless of how short it is, regardless of whether people quote it, right? Like actually putting on the table, like, look, this is what a maker movement should actually look like, I think is a valuable exercise, but hopefully a valuable document.
I think if there's the existing document, there's an exercise that could get at some of these issues. And I wonder if we take the two letters, RE, and put like remake, just put that in front of most of the making, right? Because you've got an issue there with, it goes back to like remixing, and that was a valuable part of the Grandmaster Flash culture, and it's celebrated. But as educators, to Paulo's point, if educators were running the maker fairs, reproducing other people's work is not necessarily a part of education that is, celebrated. And so if we, to Sylvia's point, if we go from the hacker space to maker space, is one of the things that I found, at least as an African American, and I don't want to be identified with the word hacker because of all of its negative connotations. And as a Black male, there's so many negative connotations already placed on me when I walk in somewhere. I'm not going to voluntarily walk into yet another one. So maker was more something that I could wear, and they didn't have any preconceived notions. Hacker, are you a terrorist, or are you X, Y, or Z? So as a remaking and remixing in an education setting, there's also a similar dynamic where if the expectation of a young African American male is that you are stealing, or is sort of negatively charged as opposed to a positive. So like remixing and remaking as opposed to being a creative endeavor is sometimes plagiarizing and, stealing and those sorts of things. So just depending on who is doing it, there's those issues too. So if that can be brought to light by just say remaking, and running that down the manifesto, does that bring up some of the differences in terms of who is doing the making and how that experience happens? So it might be an exercise worth doing.
Something else I wanted to note, I've been putting some stuff in the chat just as it comes to me, but the challenge of working with young people who may not see themselves as makers or see an entry point for making for them, they're interested in art or interested in game design or gaming, is, trying to sort of provide examples that will bring them in. So here are some projects that bring in the kinds of things you're interested in personally or artistically or whatever. And these are the ways, what that does is, so Susan gives me a touch board. I take the touch board and I take it to school and I start creating projects that I know will engage musicians, high school students, or will engage dancers. And then then the next question for those students are, how did you make that? What is that device? How does it work? How can I make something? Not rather than saying, look at this, and here's a table full of parts and put something together, which they may or may not do. Here's something that I think relates to the kinds of things that you might be interested in. Then the questions come. Then we have a good discussion, and then I'm kind of sort of guiding the discussion in some cases about how it relates to STEM. But the young people always ask me, how do you make that? How do you make that glove that when you use it, you look like a cyborg when you wear it, but then it does this really cool stuff with paintings. What is it? What is a sensor? What is, how does that work? How do you wire that thing? These are all questions that young people who may not even be interested in initially are now suddenly engaged. So how can you create a space, maker space in this case, or that engages that kind of inquiry, that kind of interest or engagement that may not just be there in of itself, is something that I'm really interested in trying to explore. It's a challenge, because then also you have to translate that to teachers who may not have that training or that experience as well, and then don't know how to engage, create curriculum around that kind of space or that kind of tinkering, and how do you incorporate that into a curriculum map? So there are a couple of challenges there in terms of putting it in a school-based program, but even in an after-school-based program. How do you do that in a way that engages all these different stakeholders across the board and maybe across disciplines, and sort of redefine maker spaces that way?
Right. So unfortunately, I have to go.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Debbie. We really appreciate. I'm going to hand it over to Juliet, but maybe what we can do is Juliet can say our thank yous and start us off in just saying what was important about this and where we'd like to go from here. Go ahead.
Sure, thanks, Susan. Well, first, thank you for everyone who's able to make it, especially Debbie and Amon and Nettrice. And I just feel like this has begun a very important conversation on the need to make it more inclusive and to take into account all the other great things that have already happened, and the different aspects of making that we have in many ways overlooked. And just a bit to add is that I think as you guys were talking, I was thinking more of in terms of making in the context in Africa is a lot different, because people do know makers, but because they don't associate making with something, unless you're making in a makerspace, it's something as grand. And I don't know if that's something that's similar in the US, but I think that's something we should add on, that people who are making more small scale projects are as important as someone who's making a giant robotics project. And how do you bring in all these conversations in, so that more people can identify with the idea of making and draw more people in, and tap into what Amon had previously mentioned, like this innate curiosity that we all have. Yeah, so I've enjoyed this conversation. And so we'll share the chats that we've had and the video and also the bios of our speakers. And Susan and I and anyone else who's interested will be working on a blog on this. But thank you all for making time for this. This has been splendid.
Thank you for the invitation.
Does anybody else have a quick comment before we say goodbye? You've left them all speechless.
I just wanted to thank all the speakers for their being generous of their time and coming to this conference, and also to the organizers. Thank you so much for all the hard work you put into it, and we'll see each other soon.
Yes. All right. Goodbye, everybody.
All
Thanks,
right, bye.
Juliet. Thanks, Juliet, so much. You did such a great job.
Thanks, guys. All right, bye.
All right. Bye-bye.